Welcome to MapleWoodian.com podcast. We have on the phone Ian Scheffler. How are you doing, Ian?
I'm great, Joe. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for having the time to talk to us. Of course, you are author of Cracking the Cube, Going Slow to Go Fast, and Other Unexpected Turns in the World of Competitive Rubik's Cube Solving. And you will be at Words in Maplewood Village Saturday, 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock. Of course, we urge everyone to go there and get the book either beforehand or at the event. But basically, you're writing about, I got to go through the book, which is really interesting, sort of your own ventures with the Rubik's Cube and sort of inside about the competitions that go on and mastering the solving of it. Why don't you give people a quick background? First of all, now the cube began in 1974, as you write, by Hungarian professor Erno Rubik.
Yeah.
Erno Rubik. Now the history of it is, why did he create it, and how did he create it?
So, funnily enough, Mr. Rubik is a lot like his own puzzle, in that if you ask 10 different people the same question about him, say the question you just asked me, you're liable to get 10 different answers, which can't possibly all be true because they all contradict each other.
Of course.
So I spent several years trying to get a handle on who Mr. Rubik is, and it took me 2 years to even get to meet him because he hadn't really sat down with a reporter since 1986.
Oh, and he's still with us?
Yeah, see, that's the interesting thing. When I started this project, I didn't know that he was still alive. He's sort of like the Willy Wonka of Eastern Europe. He's very reclusive, he's very wealthy, very brilliant. And after 2 years, I did get to, of sort of intermittent trying, I did get to meet him. And he's as blown away by the sort of rebirth of this puzzle as I was. And so he started to make more appearances in the public eye, especially in relation to this exhibit he helped design called Beyond Rubik's Cube, which was actually started out in New Jersey, in Jersey City in 2014, and is now traveling the world. It went to the Great Lakes Science Center in Cleveland, and now it's in Shanghai, of all places, where he just made an appearance. But the basic story, which seems to be beyond a doubt, is that he was someone who loved playing with shapes. He was a designer, he was an architect, and he was also only 29 years old and living at home with his mom in Eastern Europe, in Budapest, behind the Iron Curtain, which makes the emergence of this puzzle perhaps it's like the least likely place for a successful commercial invention to begin. But there you have it. So he wanted to create an impossible object because something you could change forever, but that it never changes. Like the cube is always going to be a cube, right? You could twist it the rest of your life; it'll never not be a cube. And he didn't realize it was a puzzle at first. It was essentially a total accident that he invented this because you can actually see, I've seen some of his early prototypes, which were very simple. They involved, pieces of wood, like wooden blocks. Sometimes, before he figured out that internal mechanism that allows it to turn without falling apart, he just drilled holes at the corners, stuck in some paper clips, and attached them with like rubber bands or fishing twine. And so he would twist it. And he was just kind of curious to see which pieces are going where. So he put some colored paper on each side to keep track of the pieces. And it wasn't until he started twisting it that he realized it was a puzzle. And in an unpublished manuscript, I quote from in the book, he compares the experience to going on a walk somewhere you haven't been. And you see all these pretty interesting things, which were all the patterns that the puzzle created. And he said, that was really fascinating, but at a certain point, you always want to go home if you go walking to a new place. And that was the moment when he realized he had no idea how. And he didn't even know if it could be solved, because after all, he had just created it. And it took him several months, but he did eventually figure out how to solve it.
Now, give us your background. You grew up in Los Angeles or Santa Monica?
I went to school in Santa Monica, but I grew up in L.A. I grew up in Venice Beach. And
you're basically a writer, journalist by other trade? You tell us.
Yeah. I've written for The New Yorker, The Guardian, the L.A. Times, the L.A. Review of Books. I generally write nonfiction, although I'm working on some other stuff, screenplays and comic books and things. But I grew up in L.A., and I just happened to go to a very unusual summer camp in the summer of 2005 that was stationed at a school in L.A. but run by Johns Hopkins. It's called CTY, the Center for Talented Youth. The New Yorker once wrote a piece about it and straight up called it Nerd Camp, like straight up. They're just like, that's what this is. Even I'd never heard anyone refer to it that way. It felt a little derogatory, but not unwarranted, because, when they were little nerds, Mark Zuckerberg and Lady Gaga and Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, all went to this place.
Right, and you have a chapter in the book titled Nerd Camp, which gets into that.
Yeah, I decided to borrow the New Yorker title, kind of own that badge, And that's where I first learned to solve it, because on the very first day of that camp, I happened to sit next to a young man named Toby Mao, who, by total chance, was the greatest Rubik's Cube solver on the planet. And I found this out because he was literally doing it under the table in class without looking at it, which really blew my mind, because I'd never even seen anyone solve it before, looking at it. Or, and he would do it so fast. Like, it was no big deal to him. He could do it in like 15 seconds, 12 seconds. He was always under 20 seconds. And it was no big deal to him. Like, he clearly had figured out something that I didn't know. And I really wanted to know what it was, because it was just so spellbinding. So I learned to solve it from him. And I thought that was the end of the story until years later, when I finished college in 2012, I got word that there was going to be a national championship in Las Vegas in this dumpy casino. And I thought that sounded kind of like an interesting story, and maybe there was a magazine piece in it or something, and I went on my own to go check it out. And lo and behold, Toby was organizing it along with his brother. And his brother, because Toby taught him, was basically responsible for creating the FIFA of Rubik's Cubes along with this Dutch banker. And they're less corrupt because they have no money, but they're in like almost 80 countries by now. They're on every continent but Antarctica. They hold hundreds of competitions a year. They have 60,000 members. And all that had been written about them were these sort of topical articles that basically, someone would show up for an hour or two and, be kind of amused by all of this and come back with a headline that basically said, the 80s are coming back, or, look at these nerds, isn't that interesting? And, because I knew how to solve the puzzle, I knew that what they were doing was something much more interesting, because I had no idea how they solved it so fast. There was clearly something else going on, which is what the subtitle alludes to, because I heard from these people over and over, the faster we go, the slower it feels, which really didn't make any sense, and so I wanted to try to figure it out on my own. And initially, though, I wasn't going to compete. I didn't think that I really had it in me, or that I would, be able to do it, until Toby basically challenged me. I said, can I come write about this? And he got offended. He's like, how can you write about this and not compete? What do you mean you're not going to compete? How can you say you understand this unless you do it? And that sort of, I happened to go look back at my old summer camp yearbook, and I'd sort of forgotten about this, but he had challenged me to go under 20 seconds years ago, which I hadn't done. And that's sort of like the 4-minute mile of solving a Rubik's Cube.
It's 20 seconds.
20 seconds, right. Yeah. So, it's not the world record, but once you pass that mark, that's a big mark of distinction. So then it was like challenge accepted, and I started falling down the rabbit hole until a book came out the other side.
Now, it was created in 1974. Obviously, it probably took years to sort of find its way to the U.S. Of course, the big craze in the U.S. was in the 80s. You were born in 1990, as you write. What do you know about why, I remember the 80s when it caught on, what do you think made it such a hit, and then why did it sort of die away into the little zone that it's in now of competitions? What was sort of the big fire from what you have learned about the 80s fad and then sort of going away to where it is now?
So this is a very complex question. I do also want to make clear that the way it is now is not so much like a tiny area with the.
I'm not saying tiny. I shouldn't say tiny. I'm saying it's got its niche of, and maybe it's a new craze, an even bigger craze, that it's become this competition beyond. In the 80s, people would get it, they'd try to solve it. A certain group would probably become good at solving it and keep going. And then there was a fad element where people would sort of try it and not get it, and sort of it faded away. But what was the initial attraction, do you think?
So the initial attraction, I think, is that no one had ever seen anything like this. I mean, it's very hard to define. Like, one of the questions I went into this book trying to answer is what has made Rubik's Cube such an enduring part of popular culture? Because, now, troll dolls, obviously there's like a troll movie, I guess, with Justin Timberlake, but I don't think we're all going to be playing with troll dolls.
Right, and back in the day, Rubik's Cube, it was Cabbage Patch dolls. You obviously too young to remember those, and they were another craze and things like that. But go ahead.
Yeah. So, it's so baked into the culture that, I had an editor at The Guardian who didn't even realize that Edward Snowden used a Rubik's Cube. I mean, he when I started doing this project and I started just reading the news as I normally do, it was like the Sixth Sense. It was like, I see dead people, but I see Rubik's Cubes. I mean, it is literally everywhere. Like when the Obama administration was negotiating with Iran, his lead negotiator, this lady in the State Department, for 5 minutes had an extended metaphor during one press conference about this is all like a Rubik's Cube, waiting for the pieces to come together. You see it in the movies, you see it in TV, you see it in the news. It's all over the place, and yet we don't even notice it because we just figured that's it's always been there, but it hasn't always been there.
Right.
As you say, it was this huge craze in the 80s, and I think it has to do with a couple things. The Rubik's company has tried to digitize the cube several times, and it's never really taken off. And I think that's because the cube literally and metaphorically has many sides to it. You can play with it and not try to solve it. You can just enjoy twisting it.
Mm-hmm.
I got to speak to the producers of that movie, The Pursuit of Happiness, which... of
course, that's the Will Smith movie where he talks about where his character, based on a true story, broke into Dean Witter and got his own career from pursuit of basically trying at all odds. But go ahead. And in the book, you mentioned that Will Smith is a big Rubik's Cube.
Yeah. So the thing is that the kid who taught me was hired to teach Will Smith for that movie.
Right.
Which I found out, and the producers never learned to solve it, but they still have Rubik's Cubes in their office, and they play with them every single day. And I was like, why do you do that? They're like, we just tore the stickers off. We just like twisting it because it's like a stress ball. So under the table in these bigwig Hollywood meetings, there they are, just clicking away with their Rubik's Cubes, even today. Like this guy literally had one next to the phone he was talking to me on. So, the Rubik's Cube is when it was first, there's a whole story to like how did it get out from behind the Iron Curtain involving this Holocaust survivor named Tom Kramer, who married into the British aristocracy and founded a German toy fair and spent years traveling the world trying to convince people that it was worth something because, the toy executives he met with said, well, clearly there's no market. How many Harvard professors are there? It's impossible to solve. Like, all the things that made it such a success on the face of it would make it not a success. It doesn't light up, doesn't tie into a pre-existing piece of intellectual property like, a movie or a cartoon or a TV show. Although they did make a Rubik's Cube TV show.
Yes, I think I remember that.
Yeah, I think it was, I can't even remember the name at the top of my head, but Family Guy once made fun of it because they often like making fun of 80s stuff, but it was just very, it was a magic Rubik's Cube, and if you solved it, it came to life, and there was an evil wizard and a bunch of kids, and it, pretty fantastic story. But anyway, it didn't come from anywhere. It really is almost impossible to solve on your own. I mean, I've interviewed hundreds of people, and very few of them have had the intellectual chops to figure it out with no outside help. It's a really, really complex puzzle, even though it only has 20 moving pieces. And so, ironically, all those things are what made it such a success, because it was so bamboozling. It had all these colors that were beautiful to watch. It was fun to twist. There's this tactile sensation. It bypasses any barrier that might confront another design object or toy. You don't need to know a certain language. You don't need to have a certain background. You don't need to be a certain gender or come from a certain place. I found a photograph in an old National Geographic of two boys in loincloth huts in a remote part of the Amazon, who happened to be playing with one. And they just had this, it was never clear in the article why they got one. Did the reporter bring it? Did it fall out of a plane? Did a missionary bring it? And the look on their faces was the same look of wonder and delight that you'd see on, kids being interviewed on TV back in the 80s. So, it really connects with something that I think is very deep in the human about trying to make order out of chaos. It touches on some very deep philosophical concerns that all of us, are sort of striving to deal with in our own lives. Setting aside sort of the complex mathematics it embodies, it's that rare thing that is more than one thing. And I think if you could reduce its popularity to a single factor, then it probably wouldn't have stuck around the way it has. But, it has served as the inspiration for fashion shows. Chanel has done a Rubik's Cube purse. It has served as the inspiration for art. There's a street artist in France who's like the French Banksy, who created, whole paintings using stacks of Rubik's Cubes where each one is sort of just 9 pixels, kind of like a mosaic. You can make competitions out of it. There's so many directions you can take this puzzle that it never exhausts itself. And when I got to meet Mr. Rubik, that's something he put very beautifully. He said, he can say it's a finished object, meaning it doesn't need an instruction manual. It's totally self-contained.
Now, where is, I'm sorry, and of course we're talking to Ian Scheffler, author of Cracking the Cube. He'll be at Words Bookstore in Maplewood Village on Saturday, 5 to 7 p.m. come out and check out his appearance, and he'll be there to answer your questions, of which I'm sure there are many. What is, first of all, is it part of it the simplicity of what this is? This is an object. It's dealing with colors. It's like you said, it's something you have to move around in your hand, and it is international. There's no language barrier. There's no there's no sound involved, no buzzers or flashing lights. Is it the simplicity of it that really brought it about? Maybe in a world in the 80s when we had computers, we were pre-internet, but there was a lot of new sounds and MTV and cable, and this was sort of a basic, simple premise with a great deal of challenge to it.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of its initial appeal and also its enduring appeal, because it's such an interesting study in contrast that it's so simple and yet so hard. It's so diminutive and yet so monstrously big. I mean, if you were to stack all of the possible combinations of Rubik's Cube in a line, it would stretch over 600 light years into space. And that's all in just one little thing that fits in the palm of your hand. It's like having a universe in the palm of your hand.
And where is... I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
And where is Mr. Rubik these days? Is he sitting on a pile of money somewhere, or is he still teaching?
He still lives in Budapest, which is where I got to go see him. And he's so under the radar that most folks in Budapest aren't aware he's still alive.
Oh, my gosh.
So he can just kind of walk around. You got the best of both worlds. He invented the world's most popular puzzle, and yet he can walk down the street. Steve Jobs could never do that. I met Aaron Rubik at a cafe in a nice neighborhood in Budapest, and he was just sitting there on the patio waiting for me. And I got out of the train, and there he was.
Has he gotten
a real moment?
Has he gotten all the revenue and success monetarily from this, or did anyone pay him off and make the real money? Is he still making money? How did the business side of this work?
So these are privately held corp companies. I haven't gotten to see the books, but yes, he does still make money from the cube. I mean, he licensed it to, it's sort of been like past the intellectual property hot potato. It's passed around. It went all the way to the CBS Corporation until they sold it after the bust. It was huge in the 80s, and then I think everyone got sick of it and it died. I mean, some people in Palo Alto invented it. They patented a device called the Cube Smasher, which had an instruction book about how you could break the cube all these different ways with this hammer. Basically, it was just a plastic hammer. So people got tired of it, and then the craze died. And the little company founded by that Hungarian Holocaust survivor who initially discovered it, bought all of the rights back for a song, and they kept it ever since. And, that they believed that this could be like Scrabble or Monopoly. It has come back in terms of sales figures to millions of units a year. They've, branded and expanded to Rubik's Cubes, mini fridges, underwear, flashlights, and stuff. So it's much bigger than after it died in the 80s, although it's not, it's more sort of steady. It's like a slow burn. It's not a huge explosion. And so Mr. Rubik does, he lives quite comfortably. I heard all these rumors of someone, very respectable people saying things like, he lives in a castle with one floor for every one of his kids, or he owns one of the hills of Budapest. And, when I spoke to one of his sort of close advisors, that guy said, well, that's all very funny, but it's not true. But what was true, funnily enough, is that he literally could have bought, apparently, half of the whole country of Hungary in the 80s if he'd so chosen. Because he had so much more money than anybody else.
My God.
During communism, he could have bought factories, swaths of land. He could become sort of the baronial puzzle maker of Eastern Europe. But he's not someone who does things for the money. I mean, he invented this when he was just a design professor living at home because he loves shapes. He loves design. I mean, he's someone who's at once very intellectual and yet very grounded. His father was an engineer and his mother was a poet. So he's literally the union of art and science. He counts among his influences everybody from Isaac Asimov, the science fiction writer, to Michelangelo. And so for him, the pleasure of doing this sort of thing is just doing it. I actually, one thing I'll certainly treat the Words folks to on Saturday is a few tales of Mr. Rubik, and what I got to know about him, because he is so much more than, he's not somebody who made sort of a killing in a business and then just kind of retired to live in, Bora Bora for half the year. It's like he really, I guess for him it's not a bad thing to have made money, but that's certainly not why he did it.
And let's fast forward to today, which is basically a lot of what your book is about, is the ongoing competitions and the challenge. You opened the book, like you said, at the Rubik's Cube World Championships in Vegas in 2013. How big is the competition today, and what is sort of the atmosphere and challenge at these events?
So it's gotten quite large. The World Cube Association has had 60,000 people now, more or less. I think it's slightly more now because it keeps growing every week. They've had about 60,000 people register, meaning 60,000 people have attended a competition, because you can register, but then you have to attend a competition to join the group. And it has gotten to the point where, this started out in 2003 with the revival of the World Championship, and about 100 people showed up, close to 100 people, representing a number of different countries. And it was the first competition since the first World Championship in the 80s. And in the 80s, it was sort of sponsored by the Rubik's Company. It was basically an exercise in branded, in sort of advertising. And now it really has come back as this very communal kind of, it's for the cubers. Like, cubers have come up with this. There's a whole rule book. People run these competitions on a volunteer basis. And it's rapidly evolving. I mean, it's getting to the point where there are sponsored athletes who get flown to competitions. They have jerseys with their sponsor logos on them. They're driving NASCAR cars. They've got, puzzles that they help design that, they get a cut of the sales of. And the biggest competition in history recently took place in China. There were over 1,000 people who registered. In China, the cube is so big now that you can go to cube school after school, I've been told. I didn't have a chance to visit for the book, unfortunately, but if this ever turns into a documentary, I do hope we will visit. The way in the U.S. you might go to music school after school, in China you can go to cube school and learn to solve the cube. It's apparently quite popular in school curricula there. And so it's getting very big. The biggest competition I went to was that World Championship, which had about 600 people. And to give you a sense of the atmosphere, like one Rubik's Cube will make a little clicking sound, like tick, 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 tick. But if you put several hundred people doing that together in a small space or an enclosed room, it creates this energy that sounds almost like a rainstorm, or, when I first heard it, almost like a hurricane had entered the building.
Of all the clicking going on?
Yeah, all the clicking, hundreds of puzzles going tick, 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 tick.
So when you're at a competition, what is is the competition all about speed? Just everyone has one, and then... and are you given the cube as you would get it in the store? Obviously, you don't get it all completed. Do they mix it up for you? How does that work?
These are very good questions, because it does take it's taken a great deal of thought to make this work fairly and seamlessly. So you do actually bring your own puzzle. Mm-hmm. You're allowed to bring your own puzzle, and then you bring it solved, and you give it to the scramblers. No matter what event this is. So there's volunteers whose only job is to take your cube and run it through a computer program that will generate a random position for the cube.
Interesting.
And then all the cubes in that heat get mixed up to look like that random position.
So you bring your cube, and then a computer decides how to mix it up, for lack of a better word. Is there a more official term for...
scrambling.
Scrambled. So you get they're all scrambled the same way, but a computer decides how to do it.
Yes.
So so every time there's a different scramble that you have to solve.
Yes. I mean, the odds are, because the cube is just the sample space of the cube is so large that even if you were doing it by hand, you would likely never repeat, because there's just so many possibilities. There's 43 quintillion permutations, which is a really mind-boggling number. Yes. It's 43 billion. It's the early marketing materials for the cube used to say that it had billions of combinations, which is as gross and underestimated, saying that Bill Gates has a lot of pennies, because you're off by a factor of a billion. So, it gets scrambled by that computer program, and then you all are starting from the same position, but it's all a position you've never seen before.
And then it's essentially a speed chase to see who solves it first?
Well, yes.
Or is it more than that?
In competition, there are 17 different events. It's almost like the Olympics. And,
wow.
And most of them are speed, and they sort of vary based on how you solve it. Like, you can solve it blindfolded, with your feet, one-handed. You can just solve it with 2 eyes, 2 hands, which is the traditional way. Mm-hmm. And that's always for speed. But there is also another event called the Fewest Moves competition.
Wait. People are solving the Rubik's Cube with their feet?
Yes, the world record for that, believe it or not, is all the way down to 20 seconds.
Is this someone who has no hands and has learned to use their feet, or just
no? This is
nimble person?
Another event. Yes, there's
oh my gosh!
the two best folks are a guy in Brazil and a guy in Poland, and I've seen them do it.
I've tried to pick my shoe up with my feet, and I can't do that, let alone solving.
Yeah.
That is amazing. What is some of the other? And we'll leave some of this for people to talk to you about at Words. So we don't want to. I could talk to you about it all day because this is really fascinating stuff. What would you say? The last thing I'll ask is, and again, thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
What is sort of the solution to solving it? What is sort of the broad, if there is one, or is it too intricate to really explain without having the mind to do it?
No. I can totally. I mean, I spent a lot of time thinking of metaphors that make sense. So, the secret is that there is no secret. So, the faster you get, the more improvisatory your solutions get. Because if you're at a very beginner's level, the book includes an appendix that sort of, if you want to learn to solve it, this is what you should go do. If you just want to learn to solve it, do this. If you want to get faster, do this. And if you want to become competitive, do all these things. Mm-hmm. Because there's a lot of different methods to solve the cube. There's, really, in theory, an infinite number of ways to solve it, because you could just travel from one unscrambled state to another for the rest of your life before arriving at the solved one. Most of us have gravitated toward a certain method, which I'll talk about. It's got kind of a funny New York, New Jersey area connection called the Friedrich method, or CFOP. And that's like solving the cube as if it were a layer cake, like layer by layer, but some people do it starting at the corners. Some people build blocks as if they were solving Legos, then connecting them. There's no right or wrong way to do it. But really, it's never, because it's never the same beginning point, it's never exactly the same solution. You can't just do exactly the same sequence of moves every time to solve it, which is why it's so addictive and so interesting when you get into it, because it's like playing chess at the speed of table tennis, because you have this incredibly complex logical problem, but it's different every time in meaningful ways. So, I know that no solution I've ever done is exactly the same. So, like I say, it's very improvisatory. I'll talk a lot at Words, or talk a little bit about. It's a lot like music. I mean, a lot of folks play instruments, kids, adults, and they know what that's like. And it's an interesting corollary, because you learn certain things that are rote, like scales or like your chords, progressions. But then if you're actually playing a piece of music, it's combining those things in fun and interesting ways. And if you're improvising or sight reading, it's got this flavor of novelty, and that's really what solving a Rubik's Cube is all about. You do learn certain things, certain routines, in order to say, I want to cycle 3 edge pieces counterclockwise. Well, if you see that case, here's one way to do it. But it's not like every step of solving is cycling 3 edge pieces counterclockwise. You've got to move corner pieces and edge pieces together. You've got to solve the cross. You've got to go right into Jesus fish. I mean, there's all kinds of things which we have kind of funny-sounding, little mnemonics for that come up, and you don't know where they're going to come up. And so it becomes very exciting. And I'll really get into explaining this with the subtitle of Going Slow to Go Fast.
Yes.
It becomes the very almost meditative procedure where, in that movie The Matrix, Neo's moving so fast that everything looks really slow. That's what the headspace you need to be in to solve a Rubik's Cube fast, which is a really almost sort of enlightening state of, psychologists call it the flow state, and, it's experienced by athletes, by ballerinas, by, workers in a factory line, and you're really in the zone and in the moment. And so it becomes much less about the math and about the logic, and much more about sort of finding some degree of inner peace, which sounds probably to anyone listening like, I'm just totally wackadoo over here, but that's what I thought when I first heard people saying this about a Rubik's Cube, and then I found out it's totally true.
No, that's probably true for a lot of challenges that people take. You have to sort of go slow. You have to let yourself get involved in it. One person who was a lot better at the cube than me once said to me, one of the tricks they learn is that the middle square never moves. And if you kind of use that is true. As part of a larger look at it, that kind of helps realizing that whatever the middle square is, that's what that whole side is going to be when it's solved.
That's very true. Very true.
And you probably also have to sort of look at it as a whole, I would think. You kind of have to imagine the whole cube is one thing that you have to organize in a certain way rather than looking at each side. I don't know.
Yes, that is true. I mean, in theory, it's funny. Sometimes you hear people say, "Oh, well, I once got all 5 sides, but not the 6th," which is actually mathematically impossible.
Yeah, I would think that's impossible.
If you did solve all 5, the 6th is by definition solved.
Right.
But yeah, you do have to consider the whole, because you can't do anything. Every move you do changes something else.
Right.
So
Such is life.
Yes, it's a great metaphor.
I'm sure Rubik's Cube is a great, major metaphor, more than we even know. Well, thank you very much for your time again. We've been talking to Ian Scheffler, author of Cracking the Cube, Going Slow to Go Fast, and other unexpected turns in the world of competitive Rubik's Cube solving. Let's give another plug that you will be at Words in Maplewood Village this Saturday, December 3rd, from 5 to 7 p.m., and you also have a website, ianscheffler.com, where you can read all about Ian and see more about his other appearances and writings, and the book will be there for him to sign and chat about. And it's perfect time at Christmas to pick one up as a gift as well. So we will see you there, and thank you very much for your time and for this great insight into this world that is still a great challenge and obviously going strong.
Thank you so much for asking such great questions.
Thanks. Be well.
You too.